Every few years, the world wakes up to another political crisis somewhere far away. And somehow, the same familiar fingerprints keep showing up. Leaders fall, government collapse, and suddenly the phrase U.S. foreign policy interests starts trending in academic papers. So today, let's take a not-so-gentle walk through 5 famous moments when the United States decided another country needed replacement. Not conquest. Of course, this is the 21st century. That would sound bad. This is about freedom and national security. You know the usual. Guatemala, 1954. When fruits became a national security threat. Guatemala in the early 1950s was doing something radical, having democracy. President Jacobo Arbenz became president in 1951 and decided that maybe, just maybe, land that wasn't in use should not just sit idle while people were starving. Sounds reasonable, right? Well, not to America. The U.S. didn't like the idea that Guatemala was having all these nice reforms, because they feared that other nationalists in Latin America would get the same idea and decide to fight the big bad country. And things got prickly for the Guatemalans really fast, because the United Fruit Company, UFC, a powerful American corporation who also had serious ties to U.S. officials, were affected by the new reforms. How were they affected? Well, they just couldn't get exploitative labor again, and how will their big corporation work without exploitative labor? The UFC proceeded to lobby campaigns to persuade the U.S. to overthrow the Guatemalan government. Suddenly, Arbenz wasn't a reformer anymore. He was a communist menace. Now, as far back as 1952, President Harry Truman had already approved of something called Operation PB Fortune, which was basically an early attempt to take Arbenz out of power. Except it didn't fully take off. So just think of it as the rough draft before the final version. Then enters Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was elected on a promise to battle communism, and 2 of the most powerful men in his administration, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and CIA Director Allen Dulles. Both men who just happened to have strong ties with UFC. Pure coincidence, obviously. The U.S. government immediately started painting Arbenz and his advisors as communist, even though the evidence was generous at best. Still, that was enough because, in August 1953, Eisenhower gave the green light for Operation PB success, and the CIA got to work. The U.S. funded 480 men, led by Carlos Castillo Armas, and when they crossed into Guatemala in 1954, the operation went badly, and militarily, the entire thing was a mess. But the U.S. didn't plan to win with military force. Oh no, they had a much sinister plan. The U.S. secret weapon was not guns, nor was it fear. They made the Guatemalans believe that they either give up or the United States would invade. There was propaganda, radio broadcasts, and even a naval blockade, all designed to make invasion feel inevitable. And it worked. What other expectation was there? Arbenz resigned on June 27, 1954, and 10 days later in San Salvador, Carlos Castillo Armas was declared president. The justification? Preventing communism in the Western Hemisphere. The result? Decades of political instability, military rule, and a brutal civil war that killed over 200,000 people. But look on the bright side. Corporate interests were protected, and that's all that really matters to the U.S. Chile, 1973. Democracy, but make it less socialist. Chile elected Salvador Allende in 1970, democratically, fairly, transparently, only that there was one slight hiccup. Allende was a socialist, and during the Cold War, that was the equivalent of declaring war on capitalism. The U.S. government created a favorable atmosphere for a coup to happen by supporting the military in Chile and helping destabilize the economy because nothing says defending democracy like sabotaging one. By 11th September 1973, the Chilean military led by Augustus Pinochet staged a coup to overthrow Allende and his coalition government. During the attack, Allende refused safe passage for exile during his final speech, and he died in the palace. Although some people suspect foul play, his death was generally accepted as suicide. Following the coup, a military junta was established, and all left-wing movements were suppressed, and Pinochet swiftly consolidated power and was declared president. You can guess who was the first in line to congratulate the new liberated country and their president. Ukraine? It starts with U but ends with S. The U.S. immediately showed support for the consolidation power. President Nixon was more than excited to have the military in power, even though the coup was described as one of the most violent events in all of Chilean history. But Chile was now regarded as business-friendly, so the mission was a success in certain circles. Eventually, Pinochet stepped down, handing over the country to the people after nearly 2 decades of military oppression, all thanks to their Western liberators. Afghanistan, 2001. You can remove a regime, but good luck keeping it gone. After the event of 9/11, the U.S. decided they were done with terrorism and decided to take matters into their own hands. The U.S. demanded that Afghanistan extradite Osama bin Laden and shut down al-Qaeda. But if the Taliban heard the U.S., they chose not to care because they ignored all of their requests, and that made the U.S. pissed. The U.S. invaded Afghanistan to remove the Taliban and dismantle al-Qaeda. This one came with a clear objective, and for once it seemed like they were really fighting for freedom. At least, that was what it seemed like at first. But before anyone knew what was happening, the U.S. mission began to expand, from nation-building to counterinsurgency, and it was almost like they forgot what the fight was supposed to be about. At first, things were going well. The country was safe again. The Taliban and al-Qaeda were defeated. The U.S. looked around and saw that their job was done. Freedom had won, so time to head back home. Except, there was just one problem. Freedom had not been won. When the U.S. finally withdrew from Afghanistan, the regime that was removed in 2001 returned almost immediately, and it felt that history was hitting the rewind button. Iraq, 2003, weapons of mass destruction. If there is one phrase everyone is familiar with, it's weapons of mass destruction, and we have the good old USA to thank for it. Back in 2003, weapons of mass destruction were repeated endlessly, and it was a clear justification. But there was just a little issue, and that was the fact that these so-called weapons of mass destruction didn't exist. The Iraqis had destroyed all their nuclear facilities, but the U.S. still claimed that Iraq should provide immediate cooperation to the UN Resolution 1441, and failure to do so would result to a breach. The UNSC definitely didn't think it was a breach because they didn't do anything to Iraq, but the U.S. refused to be denied an opportunity to show off their toys. In March 2003, the U.S. launched an invasion on Iraq, stating that peaceful measures could not stop Iraq. The U.S. overthrew Saddam Hussein, dismantled the existing power structure without any solid plan to replace it, and called a regime change. Saddam was executed, and Iraq became a war zone that gave rise to ISIS. Millions were displaced, and regional instability became the order of the day. But one thing was confirmed: there was no weapon of mass destruction. It was all a big misunderstanding. Venezuela, 2026. We're not doing regime change. To the most recent victim of the U.S. Freedom and Liberation Campaign that has been successful so far, Venezuela. The U.S. captured the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, during a U.S.-led operation, and the whole world is in shock. Officially, this was framed as supporting democracy and human rights, and, of course, it has nothing to do with the fact that Venezuela has oil and there are American oil companies there. It is simply democracy and liberation. As of now, Venezuela's government remains in power, but the country is economically battered, politically divided, and constantly under external pressure. Whether or not an actual regime change happens, the strategy follows a familiar pattern: isolate, sanction, destabilize, then wait. And we've seen this happen so much in history that we can already tell how all of these would play out. Different countries, different decades, different excuses. But one thing is constant: same results and same country supposedly fighting for freedom. Regime change is often sold as a quick fix, a way to remove the bad guys and install something better. But history keeps reminding us that governments are easier to destroy than societies are to rebuild. And the irony? These interventions are almost always done under the guise of freedom and liberation, with a sprinkle of coups, bombs, and sanctions. So it's no wonder these so-called interventions never work out. So the next time you hear about a foreign government suddenly becoming a global threat, it might be worth asking a simple question. Who benefits if they're removed? Which country is sounding the warning? If you enjoyed this deep dive in history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because history doesn't repeat itself quietly.